The rain in Oak Haven didn't fall, it sagged. It was a heavy, gray curtain that smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and the faint, persistent sulfur of the paper mill 3 miles down the river. I stood in front of the vanity mirror in my bathroom, the one with the jagged crack in the bottom left corner I'd been meaning to fix since last November, and tried to remember how to breathe without it hurting. My lungs felt like they were full of the same wet silt that clogged the gutters outside. I was 32 years old, and I had spent 14 of those years pulling double shifts at the mill or waitressing at the Rusty Anchor. And all I had to show for it were calloused palms and a black dress that was a size too small in the shoulders. My father, Big Jim Vance, was lying in a mahogany box 3 blocks away at St. Jude's. They called him Big Jim, not just because he stood 6'4" in his work boots, but because he took up all the air in a room. He was a union man, a shop steward who'd fought for every nickel of our overtime pay until his heart simply gave out under the weight of 40 years of heavy lifting and cheap cigarettes. But there were whispers, the kind that crawl through the cracks of a small town like cockroaches, saying Jim had gotten himself tangled up in something darker than union dues. Something involving the new developers who wanted to turn our waterfront into condos and the hard-faced men who enforced their interests. I adjusted the collar of my dress. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, though the radiator was clanking like a dying engine, but from the knowledge of who would be at that funeral. I knew the company men would show up to pay their hollow respects, and I knew Elias Thorne would be among them. Elias, the name tasted like copper and old memories. 10 years ago, he was the boy who fixed my radiator for free and took me to the county fair, smelling of sawdust and honesty. Then the recession hit, the recruitment office opened, and the world chewed him up. When he came back to Oak Haven 3 years ago, he wasn't a mechanic anymore. He was a shadow. He worked for the people who wanted my father gone, a man who did the jobs that required a cold heart and a silent tongue. My father had warned me, Laney, that boy's soul is under a different kind of management now. You stay clear. I grabbed my coat, a heavy wool thing I'd bought at the Sears closing sale, and headed out. The Ford's engine groaned, protesting the damp, but it turned over. It always did. In this town, you either kept things running or you let the rust take you. The church was packed. It was a sea of flannel shirts tucked into dark slacks, work-worn faces, and the muffled sound of coughing. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax. I walked down the aisle, my heels clicking on the linoleum, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. These were my people, mechanics, nurses, truckers, the folks who kept the lights on while the rest of the world slept. They looked at me with a pity that felt like a lead weight. I took my seat in the front row. The casket was closed. Big Jim wouldn't have wanted people staring at him while he wasn't in a position to stare back. I stared at the wood grain instead, memorizing the swirls. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the church creaked open. A draft of cold, wet air swept in, flickering the prayer candles. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The atmosphere in the room shifted, a collective tensing of shoulders. Elias Thorne walked in. He wasn't wearing flannel. He was in a sharp, charcoal suit that cost more than my car, but he still moved with that prowling, restless energy of a man who lived in the margins. He didn't sit. He stood against the back wall, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the back of my head. I could feel them like a physical touch, a burn against my skin. The preacher, a man who'd seen more factory closures than weddings, spoke about honest labor and the reward of the righteous. He meant well, but his words felt thin. My father's reward was a plot of land in a cemetery that flooded every spring and a daughter who couldn't afford to pay off his medical bills. Halfway through the service, I felt a presence beside me. I didn't turn. He shouldn't have kept those ledgers, Laney, a voice whispered. It was low, gravelly, like tires on a dirt road. Elias. He was doing what was right for the men, I said, my voice steady despite the hammer in my chest. Something you used to understand. Right don't pay the mortgage, Elias said, and it don't keep people safe. They sent me to make sure those ledgers don't exist anymore. They sent me to close the Vance account for good. I finally looked at him. His eyes were the color of the Atlantic in winter, gray, cold, and deep. He looked tired. Not the tired you get from a long shift, but the tired that gets into your bones and stays there. He was telling me, in the middle of my father's funeral, that he was the one. He was the cleaner. He was the man sent to kill the legacy, and if I stood in the way, he was sent to kill me too. You're going to do it here, Elias. In front of God and the UAW, I felt a strange, detached sort of bravery. When you have nothing left to lose, fear becomes a luxury you can't afford. I'm supposed to follow you home, he said, his gaze dropping to his hands, hands that used to be covered in grease and were now too clean, too still. Make it look like a broken heart or a faulty gas line. Simple. Clean, then why are you telling me? He didn't answer. He just looked toward the altar. The service ended with a hymn that everyone sang off key, a dirge of longing and loss. We followed the pallbearers out into the gray afternoon. The cemetery was a mile away, a hillside of leaning stones and overgrown grass. We stood under a canopy of black umbrellas as the rain turned the red clay to soup. As they lowered the casket, the world felt very small. It was just the sound of the pulleys, the rain on the plastic, and the heavy breathing of 100 tired people. Elias stood 10 feet away, his hands in his pockets, the collar of his coat turned up. He looked like a wolf at the edge of a campfire. When it was over, people started to drift away. They shook my hand, offered casseroles they couldn't afford to make, and promised to call. I nodded and thanked them, my soul feeling like it had been scraped hollow with a dull knife. Finally, it was just me and him, and the three men in the black SUV idling at the cemetery gates. The men who had sent him. They were watching. They were the ones who held the leash. Elias walked toward me, his boots sinking into the mud. He stopped inches away. I could smell the rain on his wool coat and the faint, haunting scent of the peppermint gum he used to chew when we were kids. They're watching, Elias, I said. I know. You have the gun in the pocket? I do. Is it going to hurt? He looked at me then, and for a second the mask slipped. The shadow of the boy who'd once carved our initials into the underside of the Miller Bridge flickered in his eyes. He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray, wet hair from my forehead. His hand was warm. It was the only warm thing in the whole world. "I can't do it, Lainey," he whispered. "But if I don't, they'll send someone who will. Someone who won't even know your name. Then give them a reason to think you did," I said. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't logic. It was the desperate, raw instinct of two people who had been pushed to the edge of a cliff by a world that didn't care if they lived or died. I reached up and grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit. I pulled him down to me. I kissed him. It wasn't a cinematic kiss. It tasted of salt, rain, and the bitter copper of fear. It was a kiss of desperation, a collision of two people who were drowning and trying to share one last lungful of air. Under the eyes of the grieving town, under the cold gaze of the men in the SUV, under the heavy, judgmental sky of the American Rust Belt, I kissed the man who was supposed to be my end. His arms wrapped around me, crushing the breath out of me, his hands gripping my back with a strength that felt like he was trying to hold onto the earth itself. It was a goodbye and a confession and a prayer all at once. In that moment, the class divides, the unpaid bills, the corrupt developers, and the blood on the floor didn't matter. There was only the heat of his mouth and the frantic beat of his heart against my ribs. I pulled back, gasping. His eyes were wide, shocked. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Go," I whispered. "Tell them you did what you came for. Tell them the Vances are gone." He looked at the SUV, then back at me. He reached into his pocket, and for a heartbeat, I thought I'd miscalculated. I thought the metal would be cold against my temple. Instead, he pressed something into my hand, a heavy, brass key. "The old garage," he said, his voice a ragged edge. "Under the floorboards by the workbench. Everything your dad had, and enough cash to get you to Ohio. Don't look back, Lainey. Don't ever look back at this place." He turned and walked away, his gait heavy, his head down. He got into the SUV. The engine revved, a low, predatory growl, and the vehicle peeled away, throwing red mud against the white picket fence of the cemetery. I stood there by my father's fresh grave, the rain soaking through my seer's coat, my lips still burning. I looked down at the brass key in my palm. My hands were no longer shaking. I walked to my rusted Ford. I didn't have a suitcase. I didn't have a plan. I had a tank half full of gas and a heart that was finally, after 32 years of silence, screaming. As I drove past the mill, the 3 p.m. whistle blew. It was the sound of 1,000 men and women punching out, heading home to small houses and cold dinners, to lives measured in hourly increments and dreams deferred. I looked at the gates, at the help wanted sign that had been there for 5 years, and I didn't feel the usual tug of loyalty. I felt the kiss. I felt the heat. I drove toward the old garage, the one where Elias used to spend his Saturdays covered in oil. I knew the floorboards he meant. I knew the smell of that place, gasoline and sawdust. It was the smell of the American dream when it was still something you could build with your hands. I found the ledgers. I found the money. But more than that, I found a note, written on the back of a greasy receipt from the rusty anchor. I'll find you when the shadows get shorter. Don't stop for nothing. I tucked the note into my bra, right against my skin. I got back in the Ford and I turned onto the interstate, heading west. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, a pale, flickering light that caught the chrome of my mirror. I was Elena Vance, daughter of Big Jim, a woman who had spent her life waiting for the clock to strike 5. But as the miles stretched out and the gray hills of Oak Haven faded into the rearview mirror, I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I had been kissed by death at a funeral, and somehow it had finally made me feel alive. The road ahead was dark and the rain hadn't stopped, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the overtime. I was just driving, and in the quiet of the car, I could still feel his hands on my back, a reminder that even in a world built on sweat and sorrow, there was still a kind of love that could break your heart and save your soul in the same breath. The highway stretched out like a long, black ribbon of hope. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air sting my face. I smelled the pines, the wet pavement, and the far-off promise of a place where nobody knew the name Vance. I had one shot and a lot of almosts, and I wasn't going to miss. The town of Oak Haven was built on a series of broken promises, much like the men who lived there. It was a place where you were born into a role, and the script was written in the sweat of those who came before you. My father had played his part to the end, a tragic hero in a stained undershirt. And Elias was the villain who couldn't help but remember he'd once been a hero. As the needle on the speedometer climbed, I thought about the kiss again. It was the most honest thing I'd ever done. In a world of fake smiles at the diner and polite nods at the grocery store, that kiss was a scream. It was a declaration that we were still here, still human, still capable of wanting something more than a paycheck and a quiet grave. I reached the state line as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a bruised purple. I didn't look back. I didn't think about the bills or the mill or the empty house on Miller Road. I just thought about the brass key and the man who gave it to me. Some people say that love is a luxury for those who don't have to work for a living. They say that when you're worried about the rent, you don't have time for poetry. But they're wrong. When you're at the bottom, love is the only poetry you have. It's the only thing that isn't owned by the bank or the company. I drove into the night, the heart of the country beating beneath my tires. I was a waitress, a mill worker, a daughter of a union man, and I was free. The rain had stopped. The stars were coming out, sharp and cold like diamonds on black velvet. I gripped the steering wheel, my calloused hands steady. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the graveyard shift. I was heading toward the dawn. The drive through the night was a blur of neon signs and lonely gas stations. Each town I passed was a mirror of Oak Haven, closed down factories, darkened main streets, and the flickering blue light of televisions in small, identical houses. It was the backbone of the country, a bit curved and aching, but still holding everything up. I felt a kinship with every darkened window. We were all just trying to make it to the next day. Around 3 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop near the border of West Virginia. The air here was different, sharper, smelling of coal dust and ancient mountains. I went inside, the bells above the door jingling with a hollow sound. The woman behind the counter had hair the color of a faded lemon and a name tag that said Dot. She looked at me with eyes that had seen everything and judged none of it. Coffee's fresh, she said, her voice a comforting rasp. You look like you've been driving since the Eisenhower administration. Feels like it, I said, sliding onto a vinyl stool that had a strip of silver duct tape over a tear. She poured the coffee into a thick white mug. It was strong enough to peel paint, just the way Big Jim liked it. I sat there, cradling the warmth in my hands, looking at the flyers pinned to the corkboard next to the register. Lost dogs, tractors for sale, local church bakes, the small, fluttering heartbeat of a community. You headed somewhere or running from somewhere? Dot asked, wiping the counter with a cloth that had seen better days. Both, I think, I replied. She nodded, a slow, knowing movement. Usually goes hand in hand. Just remember, honey, the road only goes as far as you're willing to take it. Don't let the rearview mirror do the steering. I thanked her and paid with one of the 20s from the stash Elias had left. As I walked back to the Ford, the wind whipped through the parking lot, carrying the low rumble of idling diesel engines. The truckers were sleeping in their cabs, giants resting before the next leg of the journey. I felt small, but not insignificant. I was a pebble kicked down the road, but I was still moving. I got back on the road, the coffee humming in my veins. My thoughts drifted back to the garage. I pictured Elias standing there years ago, showing me how to change an alternator. His hands had been stained black with oil, but he'd handled the tools with a grace that bordered on reverence. Everything's got a logic to it, Laney, he'd said, his brow furrowed in concentration. If it's broken, there's a reason. You just gotta find the piece that isn't doing its job and fix it, or replace it. I wondered if he thought he was the broken piece. I wondered if he thought he could be replaced. The company he worked for, the developers, the suits, they didn't care about logic. They cared about leverage. They'd used Elias because he was a man with a specific set of skills and nowhere else to go. They'd turned his loyalty into a weapon and his history into a chain. But that kiss had been the moment the chain snapped. By the time the sun started to bleed over the mountains, I was in Ohio. The landscape flattened out, vast fields of corn and soy stretching toward the horizon, punctuated by the occasional red barn and silver silo. It was beautiful in a way that felt honest. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was, hard-working land. I found a small motel on the outskirts of a town called Clay Creek. The sign was missing the M, and the O flickered fitfully. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and old cigarettes, but the sheets were clean and the lock on the door was solid. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally opened the ledgers my father had kept. They weren't just lists of names and numbers. They were a map of the corruption that had been eating Oak Haven from the inside out. My father had documented every bribe, every safety violation overlooked for a kickback, every secret meeting between the city council and the developers. He'd kept it all. He hadn't been looking for a payday. He'd been building a cage for the men who thought they owned us. And then I found it. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a photograph. It was me, maybe 7 years old, sitting on the hood of my father's old Chevy. I was laughing, a gap-toothed grin, and he was standing behind me, his big hands on my shoulders. On the back, in his cramped, unsteady handwriting, he'd written, "For Lainey, so she never has to work the graveyard shift." The tears came then, not the quiet, dignified tears of the funeral, but a racking, soul-deep sob that shook my entire body. I cried for my father, for the life he'd lived and the one he'd tried to save for me. I cried for Elias, trapped in a suit that didn't fit his soul. And I cried for the girl in the photograph who didn't know yet how hard the world could be. When I finally emptied myself out, I felt a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't just running anymore. I was carrying the weight of my father's truth, and I was carrying the hope of the man who'd let me go. I spent the next few days in that motel room, laying out the documents, connecting the dots. I realized that the money Elias had left wasn't just for me to escape. It was a lifeline, a way to survive long enough to make sure the ledgers reached the right people. I thought about the risk. If I sent these to the federal authorities, Oak Haven would explode. People I knew, people who'd taken those bribes because they were desperate, would lose everything. But if I didn't, the developers would keep carving the heart out of the town until there was nothing left but empty shells and high-priced condos that none of us could afford. I went to the local library and used their computer. I searched for Elias Thorne. I found his service record, a Bronze Star, a discharge that spoke of events in a valley far away. He'd come home a hero on paper and a ghost in reality. I found his name linked to a security firm out of Chicago, the kind of firm that didn't have a website and only took referrals. He was in deep, and I was the only person who knew he had a way out. One evening, about a week after the funeral, I was sitting in a diner across from the motel. I was nursing a glass of iced tea and watching the sunset when a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. My heart stopped. I felt the familiar cold prickle of fear at the base of my neck, but it wasn't the SUV. A man got out, older, wearing a suit that looked like it had been lived in. He walked into the diner and looked around with a practiced, weary gaze. He spotted me and walked over. "Elena Vance?" he asked. I didn't say anything. I just tightened my grip on my glass. "My name is Miller. I'm an investigator with the Department of Justice," he said, sliding into the booth opposite me. He didn't wait for an invitation. He placed a business card on the table. "We've been looking for your father's files for a long time. How did you find me?" "A friend of yours sent us a tip, said you'd be here and that you had something we needed." "A friend?" Miller leaned forward, his voice dropping. "A man who's putting a lot on the line to make sure you're safe, Miss Vance. He told us that if we didn't get to you first, he'd burn the whole thing down himself." Elias. He'd made the call. He'd pointed them to me, knowing it would mean the end of the people he worked for, and likely the end of his own career. "What happens to him?" I asked. Miller sighed, looking out at the darkening fields. "That depends on how much he's willing to tell us. But from what I gather, he's not interested in a deal for himself. He only had one condition for cooperating. What was it? That you get a fresh start. New name, new city, and enough of a cushion to never have to clock in for a double shift again. I looked down at my hands. The calluses were still there, a map of my life as a worker. I thought about the mill, the grease, the smell of sulfur, and the sound of the 3 p.m. whistle. I thought about the kiss under the rain, a moment of pure, unadulterated defiance. He's a good man, I said. He just got lost. The world's a big place, Miss Vance, Miller said gently. People get lost in it all the time. Sometimes they find their way back. Sometimes they just find a different road. I handed him the location of the ledgers. I didn't ask for the money or the new name. I just asked for one thing. Tell him I'm not looking back, but I'm keeping the light on. Miller nodded, took the information, and left. I stayed in the diner for a long time after he was gone. I watched the stars come out, one by one, over the vast Ohio plains. I thought about the American working class, the people who build the world, who break their backs for a dream that often feels like a mirage. We are a people of grit and grace, of silent sacrifices and loud heartbreaks. I was leaving that life behind, but I would always carry it with me. I would always be the girl who knew how to fix a radiator and how to survive on coffee and hope. Months later, I was living in a small town in Oregon. I worked in a bookstore, a quiet, peaceful place that smelled of paper and old dreams. I didn't have to wear work boots. I didn't have to worry about the union dues or the price of diesel. But every day at 3 p.m., I would stop whatever I was doing and look at the door. One rainy Tuesday, the bells jingled. A man walked in, wearing a simple flannel shirt and worn out jeans. He looked older, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes, those Atlantic winter eyes, were the same. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, smelling of rain and wood smoke and the faint, haunting scent of peppermint gum. I walked over to him. I didn't care who was watching. I didn't care about the past or the future or the world outside. I reached up and touched his face. His skin was warm. "You're late," I whispered. "I had to take the long way," Elias said, his voice a gravelly comfort. "But I'm here now." And as the rain drummed on the roof of the bookstore, thousands of miles away from the mill and the graveyard, I kissed him again. And this time, it wasn't a goodbye. It was a beginning. We were just two working-class souls who had survived the wreck. We didn't have much, but we had our names, our memories, and a road that finally led home. In the heart of the American story, among the calloused hands and the quiet dignities, we had found the one thing that wasn't for sale. We had found each other. The silence of the bookstore was a far cry from the clatter of the mill. Here, the only sounds were the soft turning of pages and the steady rain against the window pane. Elias stood in the center of the room, looking at the rows of books like they were artifacts from another civilization. He looked out of place, yet he looked more like himself than he ever had in that charcoal suit. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The bookstore. You always talked about it when we were kids, but I thought the mill had swallowed all those dreams." "It almost did," I said, leaning against the counter. But some dreams are like perennials. They die back in the winter, but the roots stay deep. You just have to wait for the right season. He walked closer, his eyes scanning my face. He looked for the exhaustion, the shadows that had been my constant companions in Oak Haven. You look different, Laney. You look like you're sleeping through the night. I am, I said. And you? Are you still running? He shook his head. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. He set it on the counter between us. It was a lug nut, rusted and worn. I went back to the old garage, he said, before I turned myself in. I found this under the workbench. Remember the 72 Nova we tried to fix when we were 19? The one that never quite ran right because we couldn't get the timing adjusted? I smiled, a genuine one that reached my eyes. I remember. You swore the ghost of a dead mechanic was sabotaging us. Maybe he was, Elias said, his mouth twitching into a ghost of a grin. But I kept this, to remind me that some things are worth the work, even if they don't turn out the way you planned. I spent 6 months in a federal facility, Laney, talking, telling them everything they wanted to know about the people in Oak Haven and Chicago. They offered me witness protection, a new identity. But I told them I already had a name. I just needed to find the person who remembered it. The air between us felt thick, not with the sulfur of the mill, but with the weight of everything we hadn't said. The sacrifice he'd made, the risk I'd taken, the kiss that had started it all. The DOJ man, Miller, he said you only had one condition, I said. Yeah. Elias stepped around the counter, entering my space. He didn't ask, he just was. I told him that if anything happened to you, the deal was off. I told him that my life didn't matter, but yours did. Because you were the only thing I ever did that was right. Elias, I ain't got much, Laney, he interrupted, his voice rough with an emotion he was struggling to contain. The government took the money. The security firm is gone. I'm just a guy who knows how to fix things and has a lot of time to make up for. I work at a marina 3 towns over. I fix boat engines. It's honest work. It's quiet. I looked at his hands. They were stained with oil again. There was a fresh cut across his knuckle and grease under his fingernails. They were the hands of a man who worked for a living, hands I recognized, hands I trusted. I don't need much, I said. I never did. He reached out, his hand hovering near my waist before he found the courage to touch me. He pulled me toward him, and I went willingly, resting my head against his chest. I could hear his heart, steady, strong, a rhythm I could build a life around. I thought about that kiss every single day, he whispered into my hair. In the dark, in the interrogation rooms, in the quiet of the marina. It was the only thing that felt real. It was real, I said, pulling back to look at him. It was the most real thing I've ever felt. We stood there in the fading light of the afternoon, two people who had been forged in the fires of the American working class, tempered by loss and hardened by reality. We weren't the people we had been at 19, full of easy laughter and unscarred hopes. We were survivors. We were the people who knew the cost of everything and the value of nothing until we found this. In Oak Haven, love was often a burden, another mouth to feed, another reason to worry. But here, In this quiet town on the edge of the world, it felt like a gift. My old man used to say that people like us don't get second chances, I said, tracing the line of his jaw. He said we get one shot and a lot of almosts. Elias leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. Maybe your old man was right about most things, Laney, but he was wrong about that. We aren't an almost, not anymore. The rain outside intensified, a soothing rhythm that blurred the world beyond the bookstore windows. Inside, the air was warm and still. I thought about the funeral, the mud, the black SUV, and the desperate kiss that had been a gamble against the dark. I thought about the long road that had led us both here. We were the children of the rust and the mill, the heirs to a legacy of hard work and quiet dignity. And we had finally found a way to work for ourselves, to build something that wouldn't be torn down by developers or sold off by unions. Stay for dinner? I asked. I make a mean pot of chili, not as good as the rusty anchor, but it'll do. Elias smiled, a real one this time, a smile that broke through the shadows of his past like the sun hitting the coast. I'd like that, Laney. I'd like that a lot. As we walked out of the bookstore and locked the door behind us, the 3 p.m. whistle didn't blow. There were no shifts to clock into, no overtime to chase. There was only the evening, the rain, and the man beside me. We walked down the street, huddling together under a single umbrella. In the windows of the shops, I saw our reflection, two ordinary people, dressed in flannel and denim, looking like everyone else. But I knew better. I knew we were a miracle of timing and tenacity. We were the ones who didn't let the rust take us. And as we disappeared into the gray mist of the Oregon evening, I knew that wherever the road went next, we would be walking it together. No more graveyard shifts, no more secrets, just the honest work of loving someone who had seen you at your worst and chose to stay. The story of the Vances and the Thorns didn't end in a cemetery in Oak Haven. It began there. It began with a kiss under the eyes of the world. A kiss that said we were more than our paychecks, more than our mistakes, and more than the roles we were born to play. We were free. And for the first time in our lives, we had all the time in the world.